Have you ever been totally stuck on a tough decision? You know, one of those moments where the right thing to do just isn't obvious? Yeah, we've all been there. Today, we are going to dive into a simple but really powerful framework for untangling those kinds of ethical knots. And we're going to start with a real-world dilemma that had entire communities on edge.
So our story kicks off with something that powers literally every part of our lives: electricity. But what happens when that invisible force becomes a source of, well, deep anxiety and confusion? It's a classic case of science clashing with public fear, and it leads to a very, very tough decision.
All right, let's go back to the early 1990s. A really serious concern started to bubble up. It was all about these systems. You know, the power lines and distribution networks that snake through our neighborhoods. All of a sudden, this invisible convenience that we all took for granted was being looked at with a whole lot of suspicion.
And the claim being made? It was absolutely chilling. This wasn't some quiet academic debate. Newspapers were reporting that just living near power lines could increase the risk of cancer, particularly in kids. People were, understandably, very worried. But here's the problem. The scientific evidence was all over the place. You had conflicting studies, no clear answers. Nobody really knew what the risk was, if there even was one.
So this puts people in a really tough spot, right? If you're an engineer, do you spend millions of dollars redesigning the entire system based on data that's, well, shaky at best? If you're a parent, do you uproot your family and move? This gets to a much bigger, more universal question. How do any of us figure out the right choice when we're facing a complicated problem with high stakes and really murky information?
Well, it turns out there's a method for that, a framework that's actually designed to cut right through all that noise and get to the heart of the matter. It's all about providing clarity right when you need it most. You know, the very first step in solving any kind of ethical puzzle is to just stop and understand all the pieces you're dealing with. Instead of just jumping to a conclusion, we need to take a beat and lay out the whole problem right there in front of us.
And here's the core idea. You don't try to solve the whole messy problem all at once. That's a recipe for disaster. Instead, you untangle it by sorting all the different issues into 3 specific buckets. It sounds simple, but it's an incredibly effective technique. And you'll find that once you do this, the solution often starts to reveal itself.
So what are these 3 buckets? Well, here they are. This is our toolkit: factual, conceptual, and moral issues. By separating the problem into these 3 areas, we can look at each one clearly and start to build a logical path toward a really solid decision.
Okay, so let's start with that first category. Now this one sounds simple, but honestly, it's often where most of the confusion is hiding. It's all about just getting the facts straight.
So a factual issue is basically a disagreement over the facts of a situation. In our power line example, the big factual question was this: do these low-frequency magnetic fields actually increase the risk of cancer? Back then, that fact was completely up for debate.
And we see this happen in all kinds of complex debates, don't we? I mean, think about global warming. Some of the key factual issues there might be about exactly how much the planet is warming and what the primary causes are. Or in the debate over abortion rights, a factual issue might center on the question of when a fetus can be considered viable. These are all questions about what is, not what should be.
So the goal here is to use research to get as close to the truth as we possibly can. And look, we might not find a perfect, universally accepted answer, but we can at least figure out what is known, what isn't known, and pinpoint exactly where the disagreements are. That's progress.
Okay, so once we have a handle on the facts, or at least a handle on the lack of facts, we can move on to the next step. This one is all about defining our terms.
Conceptual issues are really just disagreements about what words or ideas mean. If we're not all using the same definitions for key terms, we can't possibly have a productive conversation, let alone make a clear decision. We're just talking right past each other. Here's the classic example. Let's say 2 people agree on all the facts. A contractor gave an engineer a $1,000 watch. Okay, but one person looks at that and calls it a bribe, while the other person calls it a gift. The entire ethical weight of the problem hinges on how you define that one concept. You have to resolve that conceptual issue before you can get anywhere.
And that brings us to the final piece of our analysis. After we've wrestled with the facts and we've nailed down our terms, we actually have to make a choice. This is where we decide what we ought to do. Once we're on the same page about the facts and the concepts, we can ask the big question: which moral value takes priority here? Is it public safety, personal freedom? Maybe it's the responsible use of company money? The moral issue is all about weighing these competing principles to find the best course of action. And this
This is the most powerful part of this whole process. By taking the time to carefully separate out the factual, the conceptual, and the moral issues, you're not just organizing your thoughts. What you're actually doing is clearing away all the fog, so that the right path forward becomes surprisingly and sometimes obviously clear.
So here's the crucial point. This framework isn't just some abstract idea for philosophers or engineers. It is a practical, hands-on tool that any of us can use to navigate the complex decisions we face, every day. So, we've basically just walked through how to go from a tangled, confusing mess of a problem to a clear process of analysis. By identifying the facts, defining our terms, and then weighing our moral principles, we create a step-by-step path to a well-reasoned plan and, hopefully, a successful resolution.
So here it is, your takeaway toolkit. The next time you're stuck, just ask yourself these 3 simple questions. First, factual. What are the actual facts we're working with here? Second, conceptual. Are we all agreeing on what the key words mean? And finally, moral. Based on all of that, what is the right thing to do?
When you break down a problem this way, you turn what feels like an overwhelming dilemma into a series of manageable questions. It gives you the clarity you need to act with confidence and with integrity. So what problem out there in your world could use a little untangling?